The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple as 8-year-old Emilio trudged along the dusty path. His small feet ached with each step, and his heart pounded with a mixture of fear and confusion. The distant rumble of a car engine faded into silence, leaving him alone in the gathering darkness of the New Mexico desert. Emilio's mind raced with questions, each one more painful than the last. Why had his parents left him here? What had he done to deserve this? The memory of his father's stern face and his mother's tear-stained cheeks haunted him as he replayed the events of the day. It had started like any other Saturday morning. Emilio had woken up early, excited for the family picnic his parents had promised. They had packed the old station wagon with sandwiches, sodas, and even Emilio's favorite chocolate chip cookies. The drive had been long, winding through the outskirts of Albuquerque and into the wilderness beyond. As the hours passed, Emilio noticed his parents growing quieter, exchanging worried glances when they thought he wasn't looking. When they finally stopped the car, it wasn't at a picnic spot but at the edge of a desolate stretch of road. His father had gruffly told him to get out, saying they'd be right back. Emilio had waited, confusion turning to fear as the minutes ticked by. Then, with a screech of tires on gravel, the station wagon had lurched away, leaving nothing but a cloud of dust and the echo of his mother's muffled sobs. Now, as night fell, Emilio's fear grew. Strange noises echoed through the sparse vegetation, the rustle of unseen creatures, the mournful call of a coyote in the distance. He shivered, wrapping his arms tightly around himself. The thin t-shirt and jeans he wore did little to protect him from the rapidly cooling desert air. Tears welled up in Emilio's eyes as he thought of home. He pictured his small bedroom with its Spider-Man posters and the worn teddy bear he'd had since he was a baby. He thought of his best friend, Tommy, and wondered if he'd notice Emilio was gone when Monday came and his seat in Mrs. Johnson's third-grade class remained empty. As the last light faded from the sky, panic began to overwhelm Emilio. He had no idea where he was or how to get back to Albuquerque. The vastness of the desert stretched out around him, indifferent to his plight. He began to run, his breath coming in ragged gasps as he stumbled over rocks and scrub brush. Suddenly, a soft rustling nearby made Emilio freeze in his tracks. He turned slowly, his heart hammering in his chest. A pair of glowing eyes watched him from the underbrush, unblinking and intense. Emilio couldn't move, couldn't breathe. He stood rooted to the spot, every muscle in his body tense with fear. As he watched, more eyes appeared in the darkness. One by one, they emerged from the shadows, a pack of wolves, their fur silvery in the moonlight. Emilio's mind reeled. He'd seen wolves at the zoo once, safely behind thick glass. But here, in the open desert, they seemed larger, more real, and infinitely more dangerous. The leader of the pack, a majestic grey wolf with piercing amber eyes, stepped forward. Unlike the others, who hung back warily, she approached Emilio with a steady, unthreatening gaze. There was something in her eyes, a wisdom, an understanding, that made Emilio's racing heart slow just a fraction. As the wolf drew closer, Emilio remained perfectly still. He remembered a nature show he'd once watched, where the narrator had said that running from a predator could trigger its chase instinct. So he stood his ground, trembling but determined not to show his fear. The grey wolf's nose twitched as she sniffed at Emilio, circling him slowly. Her fur brushed against his leg, surprisingly soft. Emilio held his breath, waiting for sharp teeth to sink into his flesh. But the attack never came. Instead, the wolf nudged him gently with her nose, as if inviting him to follow. Emilio blinked in surprise. This wasn't at all what he had expected. The wolf took a few steps away, then turned back to look at him expectantly. The rest of the pack watched, their postures alert but not aggressive. Emilio glanced around at the dark, empty desert, then back at the wolves. He had no other options, no other hope for survival. With a deep breath, Emilio took a tentative step forward. The grey wolf's tail wagged slightly, and she set off at a slow pace, glancing back frequently to make sure he was following. The rest of the pack fell into formation around them, creating a protective circle. As they traveled deeper into the desert, Emilio's fear began to subside, replaced by a strange sense of wonder. The wolves moved with silent grace, their paws barely disturbing the sandy ground. Emilio tried to mimic their movements, placing his feet carefully to avoid crunching on loose rocks or dry twigs. After what seemed like hours of walking, the pack led Emilio to a small canyon. A narrow stream trickled through the bottom, its quiet burble a soothing counterpoint to the eerie desert silence. The wolves made their way down a well-worn path to the canyon floor, where a series of small caves dotted the rock face. The gray wolf guided Emilio to one of the caves. Inside, it was surprisingly warm and dry. The floor was covered in soft sand, and Emilio could make out the shadowy forms of sleeping wolf pups. The adult wolves settled around the entrance, their bodies forming a living barrier against the night. Exhausted from his ordeal, Emilio sank down onto the sand. The events of the day washed over him, the betrayal, the fear, and now this unexpected rescue. Tears slid down his cheeks as he curled into a tight ball, his body shaking with silent sobs. The gray wolf, whom Emilio decided to call Sombra, Spanish for shadow, moved closer, her warm body pressing against his back. She let out a soft whine, as if trying to comfort him. Gradually, Emilio's sobs subsided, and he found himself drifting off to sleep, lulled by the steady rhythm of Sombra's breathing. As dawn broke over the desert, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, Emilio stirred. For a moment, he was disoriented, expecting to see his familiar bedroom. Then the memories of the previous day came flooding back, and he sat up with a start. Sombra was still there, watching over him with those intelligent amber eyes. The rest of the pack was already up and moving, some heading out of the cave while others tended to the playful pups. Emilio's stomach rumbled loudly, reminding him that he hadn't eaten since yesterday's breakfast. As if sensing his hunger, Sombra stood and beckoned Emilio to follow her. She led him to the stream, where he gratefully cupped his hands and drank the cool, clear water. Then, to his amazement, she brought him a rabbit she had caught. Emilio hesitated, unsure of how to proceed, but hunger won out over squeamishness. With Sombra's guidance, he learned to skin and prepare the rabbit, using sharp rocks as tools. Over the next few days, Emilio began to adapt to life with the wolf pack. Sombra was always by his side, teaching him the ways of the wild. He learned to move silently through the underbrush, to listen for the subtle sounds of prey, and to read the complex body language of the wolves. At night, as Emilio lay curled up in the cave with Sombra and the others, he thought about his old life. The pain of abandonment was still raw, but it was softened by the unconditional acceptance he found among the wolves. Here, there were no expectations to meet, no disappointing looks from his father, no whispered arguments between his parents about money and the future. As the days turned into weeks, Emilio's body began to change. His muscles grew stronger from constant movement, his senses sharpened by the need to survive. He learned to communicate with the pack through a combination of vocalizations and body language, finding a place in their hierarchy. Sombra became more than just a protector, she was a mother figure, nurturing and guiding Emilio through this new life. When he stumbled, she was there to help him up. When he succeeded in his first hunt, bringing down a small hare, she nuzzled him with pride. The desert, which had once seemed so hostile and alien, became Emilio's home. He marveled at the hidden life that thrived in this seemingly barren landscape, the hardy plants that bloomed after rare rainfalls, the lizards that skittered across sun-baked rocks, the birds of prey that soared on thermals high above. As summer gave way to fall, Emilio realized that he no longer thought of returning to his old life. The wolves were his family now, and the desert was his home. He had found a place where he belonged, where he was valued and loved unconditionally. And as he raced across the sand under the vast New Mexico sky, Sombra loping gracefully by his side, Emilio felt truly free for the first time in his young life. As the seasons changed and the harsh desert winter approached, Emilio's bond with the wolf pack, particularly with Sombra, grew stronger with each passing day. The pack's den, nestled in the small canyon, became a sanctuary from the biting wind and occasional snowfall that blanketed the New Mexico landscape. Emilio, now 9 years old, had adapted remarkably to his new life. His once soft hands had grown calloused from scrambling over rocks and digging for roots. His skin had darkened under the relentless sun, and his black hair had grown long and wild. To any outsider, he might have looked more like a creature of the desert than a boy. One crisp morning, As the first rays of sunlight painted the canyon walls in hues of gold and red, Emilio stirred from his sleep. Sombra's warm body was pressed against his side, her steady breathing a comforting rhythm he had grown accustomed to. As he blinked away the last vestiges of sleep, he noticed an unusual tension in the air. The adult wolves were gathered at the entrance of the den, their postures alert and wary. Emilio crawled forward, curious about what had caught their attention. As he peered out, he saw the cause of their concern. A young mountain lion had wandered into their territory, likely driven by hunger as prey became scarce in the winter months. Emilio felt a mix of fear and excitement. He had seen mountain lions from a distance before, but never this close. The big cat's tawny coat gleamed in the early morning light, its muscles rippling as it prowled along the canyon floor. Sombra let out a low growl, signaling to the pack. With practiced precision, the wolves began to move, spreading out to flank the intruder. Emilio watched in awe as they worked together, communicating through subtle ear twitches and tail movements. Without thinking, Emilio found himself moving with them, his body instinctively following the pack's rhythm. Sombra cast him a glance, her amber eyes flickering with what Emilio could have sworn was pride. The mountain lion, realizing it was outmatched, began to retreat. But the wolves weren't content to simply chase it away, they needed to make sure it wouldn't return. The chase was on, with Emilio right in the middle of it. His heart pounded as he ran alongside the wolves, his bare feet finding purchase on the rocky ground with ease. The wind whipped through his hair, carrying the scents of sage and juniper. For a moment, Emilio felt as if he were flying, one with the pack and the wild desert around him. The chase ended at the edge of the pack's territory, the mountain lion disappearing into the distance. As they made their way back to the den, Emilio felt a new sense of belonging. He had participated in protecting their home, not as a helpless child, but as a contributing member of the pack. Back at the den, the wolves celebrated their successful defense with playful wrestling and excited yips. Emilio found himself in the middle of it all, rolling around with the younger wolves and even mock growling at some of the older ones. Sombra watched from nearby, her tail wagging contentedly. As the excitement died down, Emilio's stomach rumbled loudly. The morning's activities had left him famished. Sombra nudged him gently, indicating it was time for a hunting lesson. These had become regular occurrences, with Sombra patiently teaching Emilio the finer points of tracking and bringing down prey. They set out together, Sombra leading the way across the sun-baked earth. Emilio's keen eyes scanned the landscape, looking for signs of movement or disturbances in the sparse vegetation. After about an hour of silent stalking, Sombra froze, her nose twitching. Emilio followed her gaze and spotted their quarry, a plump jackrabbit, its long ears swiveling as it sensed danger. Sombra looked at Emilio, then back at the rabbit. The message was clear, this was his hunt. Emilio took a deep breath, centering himself as he had learned to do. He began to move, his bare feet silent on the sandy ground. The rabbit, sensing something amiss, began to hop away. Emilio broke into a run, his legs pumping as he closed the distance. The rabbit zigged and zagged, trying to throw off its pursuer. But Emilio had learned from the best. He anticipated the rabbit's movements, adjusting his course with fluid grace. With a final burst of speed, Emilio lunged forward, his hands closing around the rabbit's soft fur. They tumbled together, kicking up a cloud of dust. When they came to a stop, Emilio found himself holding his prize, its heart beating wildly against his palms. For a moment, Emilio hesitated. He remembered a time when the thought of killing an animal with his bare hands would have horrified him. But that was another life, another Emilio. This Emilio understood the harsh realities of survival in the desert. With a quick, practiced motion, he ended the rabbit's life as humanely as possible. Sombra trotted over, her tail wagging with approval. Emilio felt a surge of pride at her recognition of his success. Together, they carried the rabbit back to the den to share with the rest of the pack. As the days grew shorter and the nights colder, Emilio found himself reflecting on his old life more often. He wondered if his parents ever thought about him, if they regretted leaving him behind. Sometimes, on particularly cold nights, he would dream of his old bedroom, of hot meals and warm baths. But then he would wake to find Sombra curled protectively around him, the rest of the pack nearby, and he knew he was exactly where he belonged. The wolves had become his family in every way that mattered. They protected him, taught him, and accepted him without question. Emilio's understanding of the pack dynamics deepened with each passing day. He learned to read the subtle shifts in body language that indicated mood or intent. He began to understand the complex social structure of the pack, with its hierarchies and alliances. One particularly memorable day, Emilio witnessed the pack bring down an elk, a rare and exciting event. The hunt was a masterclass in teamwork and strategy. Some wolves drove the elk towards a steep ravine, while others lay in wait to cut off its escape routes. Emilio watched in awe as Sombra, leading the main hunting party, made the final lunge that brought the massive animal down. The feast that followed was unlike anything Emilio had experienced before. The entire pack gorged themselves on the rich meat, and for the first time in months, Emilio felt truly full. As he sat with his belly distended, watching the pack lounging contentedly around him, he felt a deep sense of gratitude for this life he had found. Winter slowly gave way to spring, and the desert came alive with color. Tiny flowers bloomed across the landscape, painting the usually barren ground with splashes of yellow, purple, and red. New life was everywhere: birds building nests, lizards emerging from hibernation, and most excitingly, new wolf pups in the den. Emilio was fascinated by the tiny, blind pups, their soft whimpers filling the den with new energy. He helped Sombra and the other females care for them, bringing them food and keeping them warm when the adults went out to hunt. As the pups grew and began to explore outside the den, Emilio found himself in the role of babysitter, watching over the playful balls of fur as they tumbled and wrestled in the spring sunshine. One day, as Emilio was watching the pups play near the stream that ran through their canyon, he heard an unfamiliar sound. It was distant, but unmistakable, the rumble of a car engine. His heart began to race, memories of his abandonment flooding back. But instead of fear, he felt a fierce protectiveness. This was his home now, and he would defend it. Quickly, he gathered the pups and ushered them back to the safety of the den. He alerted Sombra and the other adults with a series of yips and growls he had learned. The pack responded immediately, fanning out to defensive positions around their territory. Emilio climbed to a high vantage point, his keen eyes scanning the horizon. In the distance, he could see a plume of dust rising from a dirt road. As he watched, a battered pickup truck came into view, bouncing along the uneven terrain. The truck stopped at the edge of a cliff overlooking the canyon. Emilio's breath caught in his throat as he saw a man step out, binoculars in hand. For a moment, wild thoughts raced through Emilio's mind. Had his parents come back for him? Had someone been looking for him all this time? But as he studied the man from afar, he realized it was no one he recognized. The man scanned the canyon with his binoculars, his gaze passing over Emilio's hiding spot without pause. After a few minutes, the man got back in his truck and drove away, the sound of the engine fading into the distance. Emilio let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. The encounter, brief as it was, had shaken him. It was a stark reminder that there was a world beyond the canyon, beyond the pack. A world of humans that now felt alien and threatening. As he made his way back to the den, Sombra met him halfway, her concerned eyes searching his face. Emilio buried his hands in her thick fur, drawing comfort from her solid presence. In that moment, he made a silent promise to himself and to the pack. This was his family now, and he would do whatever it took to protect them, even if it meant leaving his human past behind forever. That night, as the pack settled down to sleep, Emilio found himself unable to quiet his mind. The sight of the truck had stirred up memories and questions he thought he had left behind. Who was he now? Not quite Wolf, but no longer the boy who had been abandoned in the desert. As he drifted off to sleep, Sombra's warm body pressed against his side, Emilio realized that the answer didn't really matter. He was part of the pack, and that was enough. Years passed, and Emilio grew from a scrawny boy into a lean, muscular young man of 16. His once soft skin had toughened, marked by scars from hunts and scrapes with desert rocks. His long, dark hair hung in matted dreadlocks, and his eyes held a wildness that spoke of years spent far from human civilization. The bond between Emilio and the wolf pack, especially Sombra, had only grown stronger with time. He moved with the grace and stealth of a wolf, his senses attuned to the subtle rhythms of the desert. The pack's territory had expanded over the years, stretching across a wide swath of the New Mexico wilderness. One crisp autumn morning, Emilio set out alone to check the borders of their territory. It was a task he undertook regularly, using his keen senses to detect any signs of intruders or potential threats. The air was cool against his skin as he loped across the rocky terrain, his bare feet finding purchase with practiced ease. As he approached the eastern edge of their land, a strange scent caught his attention. It was faint but unmistakable, the smell of humans. Emilio's heart began to race, memories of his long-ago abandonment flickering at the edges of his mind. He crouched low, moving silently through the scrub brush as he followed the scent. The trail led him to a small clearing where he saw something that made him freeze in his tracks. A man was kneeling by a rusty old truck, tools scattered around him as he worked on the engine. Emilio's first instinct was to retreat, to run back to the safety of the pack. But curiosity, long buried beneath years of wild living, began to stir. He inched closer, using the skills he had learned from the wolves to remain undetected. The man was older, maybe in his 50s, with graying hair and weathered skin that spoke of a life spent outdoors. As Emilio watched, the man straightened up, wiping his brow with a bandana. Suddenly, the man stiffened, his head turning slowly in Emilio's direction. Their eyes met, and for a moment, time seemed to stand still. The man's eyes widened in shock, his mouth falling open as he took in the wild figure before him. "Holy smokes," the man breathed, his voice rough with disuse. You're human, ain't ya?" Emilio tensed, ready to bolt at the slightest sign of threat. But the man made no move towards him, instead raising his hands slowly in a gesture of peace. "It's okay, son," the man said softly. "I ain't gonna hurt you. Name's Juan. Juan Martinez. I'm just a old rancher trying to get his piece of junk truck working again." Emilio tilted his head, the Spanish name stirring something in the recesses of his memory. He remembered his abuela speaking to him in rapid-fire Spanish, teaching him words and phrases that had long since faded from use. Emilio rasped, his voice hoarse and unpracticed. The sound of his own voice startled him. It had been years since he had spoken aloud. Juan's eyes lit up. "That's right, son. Juan. Can you tell me your name?" Emilio hesitated, his mind racing. It had been so long since he had thought of himself by name. In the pack, identities were communicated through scent and body language, not words. But as he searched his memories, it came back to him. Io, he managed, the name feeling strange on his tongue. Juan nodded encouragingly. "Emilio. That's a good name. You look like you've been out here a while, Emilio. Are you lost? Do you need help?" The questions confused Emilio. Lost. He knew exactly where he was. This was his home, his territory. And help. He didn't need help. He was strong, capable, a vital member of his pack. But as he looked at Juan, at the truck, at the tools scattered on the ground, a flood of memories washed over him. Memories of a world he had almost forgotten. Before Emilio could respond, a low growl rumbled from the bushes behind him. Sombra emerged, her amber eyes fixed on Juan, her hackles raised. Juan stumbled backward, fear evident on his face. "Easy now," he said, his voice shaking slightly. "I don't mean no harm." Emilio turned to Sombra, communicating with a series of subtle gestures and soft vocalizations. He conveyed that Juan wasn't a threat, that he was curious about this encounter. Sombra's growl subsided, but she remained alert, her body tense and ready to protect Emilio if needed. Juan watched this interaction with a mix of fear and fascination. "Well, I'll be," he muttered. "You're talking to that wolf like it understands you." Emilio nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. Of course Sombra understood him. They had been family for years. Slowly, Juan lowered himself to sit on the ground, his movements careful and non-threatening. "Listen, Emilio," he said gently. "I don't know what happened to you or how you ended up out here. But if you want, I've got a ranch not too far from here. My wife, Maria, and we'd be happy to give you a hot meal, maybe some clean clothes. No pressure, just an offer. Emilio's stomach growled at the mention of a meal. While he was used to the raw meat and occasional berries that made up his diet with the pack, some long-dormant part of him craved the cooked food of his early childhood. He looked at Sombra, conflicted. She met his gaze steadily, and he could read the mixed emotions in her eyes: concern, protectiveness, but also a grudging curiosity. After a moment's hesitation, she gave a small nod, as if granting permission. Emilio turned back to Juan and nodded slowly. "Okay," he said, the word feeling clumsy in his mouth. Juan's face broke into a wide smile. "All right then," he said, clapping his hands together. "Let me just see if I can get this old girl started." He turned back to the truck, fiddling with something under the hood. As Juan worked, Emilio settled onto the ground, Sombra lying down beside him. He absent-mindedly ran his fingers through her fur, a habit that had always calmed him. The familiar texture grounded him as his mind whirled with thoughts of what was to come. After a few minutes, the truck's engine sputtered to life with a roar that made Emilio and Sombra jump. Juan let out a whoop of triumph. "There we go. Knew I could get her going eventually." He turned to Emilio, his expression softening. "You ready to go, son? Your, friend there can come too if she wants." Emilio stood, patting Sombra's side. He knew she wouldn't come. The truck and the prospect of human dwellings were too foreign, too threatening. But he also knew she would follow, keeping watch from a distance. With a deep breath, Emilio walked towards the truck. Each step felt momentous, like he was crossing an invisible boundary between his wild life and the human world he had left behind. As he climbed into the passenger seat, the feel of the worn leather seat was both strange and oddly familiar. Juan got in beside him, starting the engine. As the truck began to move, bumping along the uneven ground, Emilio looked out the window. He saw Sombra watching from the edge of the clearing, her form growing smaller as they drove away. A lump formed in his throat, and for the first time in years, he felt tears prick at his eyes. The drive to Juan's ranch was a sensory overload for Emilio. The rumble of the engine, the rush of wind through the open windows, the sight of the landscape whizzing by faster than he had ever experienced, it was all overwhelming. He gripped the edge of his seat tightly, his knuckles turning white. Juan seemed to sense his discomfort and kept quiet, only occasionally pointing out landmarks or features of the land. "That there's Coyote Ridge," he'd say, "or see that old barn. Been standing since my granddad's time." As they crested a hill, a small cluster of buildings came into view. A modest ranch house stood at the center, surrounded by a few outbuildings and corrals. A handful of horses grazed in a nearby pasture, and chickens pecked at the dusty ground near a coop. "Well, here we are," Juan said as he pulled the truck to a stop. "Casa Martinez. It ain't much, but it's home." Emilio's heart raced as he looked at the house. It had been so long since he had been in a human dwelling. Would he remember how to behave? What would Juan's wife think of him? As if on cue, the front door of the house swung open, and a woman stepped out onto the porch. She was short and plump, with long gray hair pulled back in a braid. Her eyes widened as she took in the sight of Emilio. "Juan Martinez, what in the world?" she called out, her voice a mix of confusion and concern. Juan climbed out of the truck, gesturing for Emilio to do the same. "Maria, honey, this here's Emilio. Found him out by Coyote Ridge. Looks like he's been out in the wild for quite some time." Maria's expression softened as she looked at Emilio. "Oh, you poor thing," she said, her voice full of motherly concern. "You must be hungry. Come on in, I've got some stew on the stove." Emilio hesitated, overwhelmed by the kindness in her voice. He looked back towards the desert, half expecting to see Sombra watching from a nearby hill. But there was no sign of her. "It's okay, son," Juan said gently. "Take your time. We're not gonna force you to do anything you don't want to." Emilio took a deep breath, steeling himself. Then, with slow, deliberate steps, he walked towards the house. As he climbed the porch steps, the scent of cooking food wafted out, making his mouth water. Maria held the door open, smiling warmly. "Welcome, Emilio," she said. "Welcome home." As Emilio stepped over the threshold, he felt as if he were crossing into another world. A world he had once known, long ago. A world that was both terrifyingly foreign and achingly familiar. Whatever happened next, he knew his life would never be the same. The first few weeks at the Martinez ranch were a whirlwind of new experiences for Emilio. Everything seemed to overwhelm his senses: the soft texture of clean clothes against his skin, the rich aroma of home-cooked meals, the gentle hum of electricity running through the house. Each day brought new challenges as he struggled to readjust to human life. Maria, with her infinite patience, took charge of helping Emilio relearn the basics of human hygiene and behavior. The first shower was a particularly memorable experience. The sensation of warm water cascading over his body was both foreign and exhilarating. Emilio stood under the spray for what felt like hours, marveling at how easily the years of dirt and grime washed away. "You're gonna turn into a prune if you stay in there much longer," Maria had called through the door, a hint of amusement in her voice. Emilio's first attempts at using utensils were clumsy at best. His hands, so deft at skinning rabbits or climbing rocky cliffs, fumbled with forks and spoons. More than once, he found himself tempted to simply use his hands, as he had done for so many years with the pack. But Maria gently corrected him, demonstrating the proper technique with a kindness that brought a lump to Emilio's throat. Juan focused on teaching Emilio about life on the ranch. He showed him how to mend fences, feed the animals, and perform the countless other tasks necessary to keep the small farm running. Emilio took to the work with enthusiasm, finding comfort in the physical labor that wasn't so different from his life in the wild. One sunny afternoon, as they were repairing a section of fence, Juan broached a subject that had been on everyone's mind. "You know, Emilio," he began, his tone casual but his eyes watchful, "we've been wondering about your family. Do you remember anything about them? Where you came from?" Emilio paused, a fence post held loosely in his hands. Memories, long suppressed, bubbled to the surface. He saw flashes of a small apartment in Albuquerque, heard echoes of angry voices arguing about money, felt the sting of disappointment in his father's eyes. "They left me," Emilio said slowly, the words feeling strange on his tongue. His voice, unused to extended conversation, was still rough and halting. "In the desert. Long time ago." Juan's face darkened with anger, but his voice remained gentle. "I'm sorry, son. No child deserves that. But you're safe now, you hear? You've got a home here for as long as you want it." Emilio nodded, unable to speak around the sudden tightness in his throat. They returned to their work in companionable silence, the rhythmic pounding of the hammer speaking volumes that words couldn't express. As the weeks turned into months, Emilio's progress was remarkable. His vocabulary expanded rapidly, helped along by Maria's patient tutoring and the books she encouraged him to read. His favorites were Jack London's Call of the Wild and White Fang, stories that resonated deeply with his own experiences. Physical changes were evident too. Regular meals and a varied diet added healthy weight to his frame. His skin, once weathered and rough, began to smooth out, though it remained tanned from long days working outdoors. Maria trimmed his matted hair, revealing the handsome young man hidden beneath years of wild living. But perhaps the most significant change was in Emilio's eyes. The wary, animal-like gaze began to soften, replaced by a growing curiosity about the world around him. He devoured information about everything from modern technology to current events, eager to bridge the gap between his old life and his new one. Despite his progress, Emilio's connection to his wild past remained strong. Often, in the quiet hours of the night, he would slip out of the house and make his way to the edge of the ranch property. There, he would let out a series of howls, hoping to hear a response from Sombra or the pack. Sometimes, faintly in the distance, he would hear an answering call, and his heart would soar with a bittersweet mixture of joy and longing. Juan and Maria noticed these nocturnal habits but never commented on them directly. Instead, they found ways to incorporate Emilio's unique skills and experiences into ranch life. Juan marveled at Emilio's ability to predict weather changes or sense approaching animals long before they were visible. Maria appreciated his knowledge of wild plants, which added new flavors to her cooking. As Emilio became more comfortable with human interaction, Juan began taking him on supply runs to the nearest town, a small place called Los Lunas. These trips were both exciting and overwhelming for Emilio. The sights, sounds, and smells of even this small town were a sensory overload after years in the wilderness. On one such trip, as they were loading supplies into the truck, a group of teenagers about Emilio's age walked by. They stared curiously at Emilio, whispering among themselves. Emilio felt his cheeks grow hot under their scrutiny, suddenly very aware of how different he must seem. "Don't you mind them," Juan said quietly, noticing Emilio's discomfort. "People round here aren't used to newcomers, is all. Give it time." Emilio nodded, but the encounter left him unsettled. It was a stark reminder of how much separated him from others his age. While they worried about dating and college applications, Emilio was still learning to navigate the basics of human society. Back at the ranch, Emilio threw himself into his studies with renewed determination. Maria, a former schoolteacher, was thrilled with his eagerness to learn. She set up a rigorous homeschooling program, aiming to help Emilio catch up on the years of education he had missed. To everyone's surprise, Emilio proved to be an exceptionally quick study. His years in the wild had honed his observational skills and problem-solving abilities. He approached academic subjects with the same intensity he had once applied to hunting or tracking. Math, with its logical patterns, came easily to him. Science fascinated him, providing explanations for the natural phenomena he had observed in the wild. Reading and writing proved more challenging, but Emilio attacked these subjects with dogged determination. He spent hours poring over books, sounding out words and practicing his penmanship. Maria found him one night, long after he should have been asleep, laboriously copying passages from The Old Man and the Sea by lamplight. "You don't have to push yourself so hard," she told him gently. "There's time." Emilio looked up at her, his eyes bright with an emotion she couldn't quite name. "Need to catch up," he said simply. "Want to belong." Maria's heart ached at the longing in his voice. She sat down beside him, placing a comforting hand on his shoulder. "Oh, honey," she said softly, "you already belong. You're family now." Emilio leaned into her touch, allowing himself to accept the comfort she offered. It was moments like these that made him realize how much he had missed human connection during his years with the wolves. As much as he loved Sombra and the pack, there was something irreplaceable about human affection. As summer faded into fall, Juan began to talk about enrolling Emilio in the local high school. The idea filled Emilio with equal parts excitement and terror. On one hand, he was eager to interact with peers his own age, to experience the normal teenage life he had been denied. On the other hand, the thought of being surrounded by so many people, of trying to fit in when he was so fundamentally different, was daunting. To help prepare him, Juan and Maria invited some of the neighboring ranch families over for dinner. It was Emilio's first real experience with social interaction outside of the Martinezes. At first, he was quiet and withdrawn, overwhelmed by the chatter and laughter around him. But as the evening wore on, he began to relax, even contributing to the conversation with shy smiles and brief comments. One of the neighbors, a kind-faced woman named Sarah, worked as a counselor at the high school. After dinner, she took Emilio aside for a chat. "It's going to be an adjustment," she told him honestly. "But from what Juan and Maria have told me, you're one of the strongest, most resilient young men I've ever heard of. You've survived things most people couldn't imagine. High school might be a challenge, but I have no doubt you'll rise to it." Her words stayed with Emilio long after the guests had left. As he lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, he thought about how far he had come. From a frightened, abandoned child to a wild creature of the desert, and now to this, on the cusp of rejoining human society fully. He thought of Sombra and the pack, wondering if they still remembered him. He thought of Juan and Maria, who had opened their hearts and home to him without hesitation. He thought of the life stretching out before him, full of possibilities he had never imagined. With a deep breath, Emilio made a decision. He would embrace this new chapter of his life fully. He would carry the lessons of the wild with him, the strength, the resilience, the deep connection to nature, but he would also open himself to all that human society had to offer. As he drifted off to sleep, Emilio felt a sense of peace settle over him. Whatever challenges lay ahead, he knew he had the strength to face them. After all, he had survived the desert. He had run with wolves. He had found his way home. High school, he decided with a small smile, didn't stand a chance. As the years passed, Emilio's life took on a rhythm he never could have imagined during his time with the wolf pack. He graduated from high school with honors, his unique perspective and experiences making him stand out in both academics and extracurricular activities. His connection to nature and his deep understanding of wildlife became the cornerstone of his future path. Emilio's passion for protecting the wolves that had been his family for so long led him to pursue a degree in wildlife biology at the University of New Mexico. College life in Albuquerque was a far cry from both the wilds of the desert and the quiet Martinez Ranch, but Emilio adapted with the same resilience that had seen him through so much. His dorm room became a curious blend of his two worlds. Textbooks on ecology and animal behavior shared space with a weathered wolf pelt, a gift from Juan and Maria when he left for college. It was a reminder of Sombra, though Emilio hadn't seen her in years. Still, on quiet nights, he would sometimes slip out of his dorm and howl softly at the moon, a habit that both amused and mystified his roommates. It was during his sophomore year that Emilio's life took another unexpected turn. He was giving a presentation on wolf conservation in his ecology class when a guest lecturer, Dr. Sarah Hawkins from the New Mexico Department of Game and Fish, happened to be sitting in. Impressed by Emilio's passion and unique insights, she approached him after class. "Your understanding of wolf behavior is remarkable," Dr. Hawkins said, her eyes alight with curiosity. "It's almost as if you've lived among them." Emilio hesitated for a moment before deciding to trust her with his story. As he spoke of his years with the pack, Dr. Hawkins listened with rapt attention, her expression shifting from disbelief to awe. "Emilio," she said when he finished, "your experience is invaluable. We've been struggling with a wolf reintroduction program, facing a lot of opposition from local ranchers. Would you consider working with us? Your perspective could bridge the gap between wildlife conservation and human interests." This opportunity marked the beginning of Emilio's career as a wolf advocate. He began working part-time with the Department of Game and Fish, using his unique experience to help develop more effective and humane conservation strategies. His ability to think like a wolf while understanding human concerns made him an invaluable asset. Emilio's work didn't stop at official channels. He started a blog, Voices of the Pack, where he shared stories of his time with the wolves, educating the public about their behavior, social structures, and importance to the ecosystem. His writing, raw and honest, struck a chord with readers across the country. As his advocacy work gained attention, Emilio found himself speaking at schools, community centers, and even a TEDx event in Santa Fe. He talked about coexistence, about understanding and respecting the wild rather than fearing it. His story of survival and adaptation resonated with people, and slowly, attitudes began to shift. But with increased visibility came increased scrutiny. One day, as Emilio was leaving a community meeting in Los Lunas, a reporter approached him. "Emilio Vasquez," the reporter called out. "I'm Jack Ryder from the Albuquerque Journal. We've been doing some digging into your background. There are records of a missing child case from 16 years ago, a boy named Emilio Vasquez, abandoned in the desert. That's you, isn't it?" Emilio felt as if the ground had dropped out from under him. He had known this day might come, but he wasn't prepared for the rush of emotions that flooded through him. Memories of that day, of his parents' car disappearing into the distance, threatened to overwhelm him. "Mr. Vasquez," the reporter pressed, "your parents have been looking for you. They want to reconnect. Would you be willing to meet with them?" Emilio's first instinct was to run, to disappear into the wilderness as he had done so many years ago. But he wasn't that scared, abandoned child anymore. He had faced down wolves, survived in the harshest of conditions, and built a new life for himself. He could face this too. I need some time," Emilio managed to say. "Please, respect my privacy for now." The next few weeks were a whirlwind of emotions for Emilio. He retreated to the Martinez Ranch, seeking comfort in the place and people who had given him a second chance at life. Juan and Maria listened as he poured out his fears and doubts, offering the unconditional support that had become the bedrock of his new life. "You don't owe them nothing," Juan said firmly. "But maybe Maybe hearing them out might help you find some peace. After much soul-searching and long talks with a therapist, Emilio decided to meet with his biological parents. The meeting was arranged at a neutral location, a small coffee shop in Albuquerque. As Emilio waited, his heart pounding, he saw them walk in. Time had changed them. His father's hair had gone gray, deep lines etched around his eyes. His mother looked smaller than he remembered, her face lined with years of worry and regret. When they saw him, they froze, a mixture of emotions playing across their faces. Emilio, his mother breathed, tears welling in her eyes. "Oh, my boy." The conversation that followed was difficult, filled with tears and long silences. His parents spoke of the financial troubles that had driven them to desperation, of the immediate regret that had set in as soon as they drove away, of years spent searching and hoping. Emilio listened, his own emotions a turbulent mix of anger, hurt, and a small, surprising flicker of understanding. When they had finished, he took a deep breath and began to tell his own story of survival, of finding a new family in the wolf pack, of Juan and Maria's kindness, and of the life he had built for himself. As he spoke, Emilio realized something profound. The abandonment, as painful as it had led him to his true calling. Without those years in the wild, he wouldn't be the person he was today, wouldn't be able to speak for those who had no voice. "I can't forget what happened," Emilio said finally, his voice steady. "And I'm not ready to forgive, not yet. But I'm willing to try and build some kind of relationship, slowly." The relief on his parents' faces was palpable. It wasn't a fairy tale reconciliation, but it was a start. In the weeks that followed, Emilio threw himself back into his advocacy work with renewed vigor. His personal story, now public, added weight to his words. He spoke openly about trauma, resilience, and the healing power of nature. At a wolf conservation fundraiser in Albuquerque, Emilio found himself sharing the stage with ranchers, wildlife officials, and even some of the people who had once opposed wolf reintroduction. As he looked out at the diverse crowd, all united in their desire to find a way forward, he felt a sense of hope. "We're not so different, wolves and humans," Emilio said, his voice carrying across the hushed room. "We both need family, territory, and purpose. We can coexist, thrive even, if we approach each other with respect and understanding." As he finished his speech to resounding applause, Emilio caught sight of Juan and Maria in the audience, beaming with pride. Next to them sat his biological parents, their expressions a mix of awe and regret. And there, at the back of the room, he could have sworn he saw a flash of familiar amber eyes and silver fur. In that moment, with his past and present converging, Emilio felt a sense of completion. He had bridged the gap between two worlds, and in doing so, had found his true place in both. The journey ahead would not be easy, but armed with the strength of the wolf and the compassion of humanity, Emilio was ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. Years passed, and Emilio's work in wolf conservation and wildlife advocacy continued to flourish. Now in his mid-30s, he had become a respected figure in the field, known for his unique approach that bridged the gap between scientific understanding and personal experience. His efforts had led to significant improvements in wolf reintroduction programs across the American Southwest, and his methods were being studied and implemented in other parts of the world. One crisp autumn morning, Emilio found himself back in the familiar terrain of the New Mexico desert, not far from where his extraordinary journey had begun over 2 decades ago. He was leading a small team of researchers and volunteers on a tracking expedition, hoping to gather data on a newly established wolf pack in the area. As they hiked through the rugged landscape, Emilio's keen senses, honed by years in the wild and maintained through his continued connection with nature, picked up on something unusual. He held up a hand, signaling the group to stop. "There's something out there," he said quietly, his eyes scanning the horizon. "Not a wolf, though. Something different." Cautiously, the group moved forward, following Emilio's lead. As they crested a small hill, they saw what had caught his attention, a young boy, no more than 10 years old, huddled beneath a scraggly juniper tree. The child's clothes were torn and dirty, his face streaked with tears and dust. Emilio's heart clenched as memories of his own abandonment rushed back. Slowly, he approached the boy, his voice gentle and reassuring. "Hey there," he said softly. "Are you lost? Can we help you?" The boy looked up, his eyes wide with fear and confusion. He nodded slightly, then burst into tears. Emilio knelt beside him, offering comfort while his team radioed for assistance. As they waited for help to arrive, Emilio learned the boy's story. His name was Miguel, and he had gotten separated from his family during a camping trip 2 days ago. He had wandered the desert, scared and alone, until exhaustion had forced him to stop. Emilio couldn't help but see his younger self in Miguel's frightened eyes. He shared some of his own story with the boy, speaking of how he had survived in the wild and found a new family. Miguel listened in awe, his fear slowly giving way to curiosity and hope. When the rescue team arrived, Emilio made sure Miguel was safely on his way to be reunited with his worried family. But the encounter left a deep impression on him. He realized that while he had done much to help wolves, there was more he could do for children who had faced experiences similar to his own. In the months that followed, Emilio worked tirelessly to establish a new program, Wild Hearts, Healing Through Nature. The initiative was designed to help traumatized and at-risk youth through wilderness therapy and animal-assisted interventions. Emilio partnered with child psychologists, social workers, and wilderness experts to create a comprehensive program that would allow children to heal and grow through connecting with nature. The Martinez Ranch, now run by Juan and Maria's children since the elderly couple had passed away, became the home base for the program. Emilio worked with the family to set up facilities that could house small groups of children, creating a safe space where they could learn, heal, and reconnect with themselves and the world around them. On the day of the program's launch, Emilio stood before a small crowd of supporters, benefactors, and the first group of children who would be participating. Among the audience, he spotted familiar faces: his biological parents, now reconciled and an active part of his life, colleagues from his conservation work, and even Miguel, the boy he had found in the desert, who had begged his parents to let him be part of the program. As Emilio began to speak, he felt a familiar presence. Turning slightly, he caught a glimpse of movement at the edge of the property. There, just visible in the shadows of the junipers, stood a wolf, old and gray, but with eyes that still shone with intelligence and strength. Sombra had returned, as if to give her approval to this new chapter in Emilio's life. With a smile and a nod to his old friend, Emilio addressed the crowd. "Every one of us has a wild heart," he began. "A part of us that yearns for connection, for understanding, for a place in this world. Some of us have had to fight harder to find that place, to hear the call of our own hearts. But in nature, in the wilderness that once seemed so harsh and unforgiving, we can find healing, strength, and a sense of belonging." He went on to explain the program, his voice filled with passion and hope. "Here, we'll learn from the wolves, their resilience, their loyalty, their ability to thrive in the face of adversity. We'll learn from the desert, its harsh beauty, its hidden resources, its quiet strength. And most importantly, we'll learn from each other, forming bonds and building a community that will support us long after we leave this place." As the first session of the program got underway, Emilio found himself working closely with Miguel. The boy's initial fear of the wilderness had given way to a budding curiosity and respect. One evening, as they sat around a campfire with the other children, Miguel asked Emilio a question. "Do you ever wish you hadn't been left in the desert? That none of it had happened?" Emilio was silent for a moment, considering his answer carefully. "There were times when I did," he admitted. "Times when the pain and loneliness felt like too much to bear. But now, looking back, I see that everything I went through led me to where I am today. It gave me a unique perspective, a way to bridge two worlds. And it allows me to help others who might be feeling lost or alone." He looked around at the circle of young faces, illuminated by the flickering firelight. "Every one of you has a strength inside that you might not even know about yet. Sometimes it takes facing our biggest fears, our darkest moments, to discover what we're truly capable of." As the weeks passed, Emilio watched the children in the program transform. They grew stronger, more confident, more in tune with themselves and the world around them. They learned to track animals, to find water, to read the stars. But more than that, they learned to trust themselves and each other. On the final night of the first session, Emilio led the group to a hilltop overlooking the desert. The sun was setting, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and purple. In the distance, They heard the howl of a wolf, perhaps Sombra, perhaps one of her descendants. Without prompting, Miguel lifted his head and howled in response. One by one, the other children joined in, their voices rising in a chorus that echoed across the desert. Emilio added his voice to theirs, feeling a sense of joy and completion wash over him. As their howls faded into the twilight, Emilio looked at the children around him. He saw in them the same wild spirit that had helped him survive, the same resilience that had allowed him to build a new life. He knew that whatever challenges they faced in the future, they would carry this experience with them, the knowledge that they were strong, that they were part of something larger than themselves, that they belonged. In that moment, Emilio felt the completion of a circle. The abandoned child had become a guide, the lone wolf had become a leader of a new kind of pack. As he stood there, surrounded by the next generation of wild hearts, Emilio knew that his journey, a journey that had begun in fear and loneliness, had led him exactly where he was meant to be. The legacy of the wolf boy would continue, not just in the wolves that now roamed the New Mexico wilderness, but in the lives of every child who found healing and strength in the wild. And as the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Emilio smiled, knowing that his story and the stories of all those he had touched were now woven into the very fabric of the desert itself, a testament to the enduring power of resilience, compassion, and the unbreakable bond between humans and nature.